And we continue learning Dirshu Mishnah Berurah Hilchos Netilas Yadaim Siman Kof No Netes. And we pick it up from a Sif Zayin, which really is a direct continuation of that which we saw in the previous Sif. This is going to be a little bit more actually of the background and the explanation as to the very basic requirement necessary when it comes to Netilas Yadaim. Says the Mechaber, a critical ingredient that the water has to come from the kayach, from the power of the noisin. This is what we referred to in the previous year as kayach, gavra, that the person has to be the one enabling, facilitating, and pouring the water literally. Lefikach, therefore. You have a pipe that takes water and is dripping or pouring water from the ocean. Then it goes to water the field. You can't put your hands in it to have the water go on it. You have a hose and the water is coming out. You can't just stick your hands underneath it and wash your hands. Similar to that would be a sink. You have an open faucet. You can't just stick your hands underneath it. Why? Because the koyach of the sheifech, the power of the one pouring, the power of the one that started the action, is no longer there. The mesim yadav karav l'makim hashvicha. You put your hands close by. Then it could potentially work. So if you're close to the original point that the water is being poured, then if I pour water down a tube and your hands are right there, then it will work. If it's further down the road, it will not work. Let's say you dip your hands into the pipe. Tefillah does not work. It's not considered tefillah. Why not? Because tefillah only works in a mikvah. And over here, the water is considered she'uvim, considered drawn water. So really the case over here is, to be more precise, is you have one person pouring water into a tube, into a pipe, runs down that pipe into the field. So that's where the Mechaber just taught us that if you put your hands at the end of the pipe, then it's not going to work, because then you're no longer getting from the koyach of the noisy. If you put your hands at the beginning of the pipe, then it will yes work. Aval continues the Mechaber of Naisin Oisam Chutz Latziner of Mamshech Oisam Latziner. Put your hands outside the pipe and you draw them towards the pipe. It hits the yad when you dip your hands in it. This is an interesting halacha, which maybe will have some unique applications. Mayim she'uvim, drawn waters that were pulled literally, are going to be kosher. We'll see what that means. Actually, before we go any further, let's go back. Let's see the Mishnah Berurah up until this point, and then we will go further. Mishnah Berurah Sivkat Lamed Vav Shedoyle Mayim Rotzolayim Shedoyle Adam Mayim Anayar. This is what we just explained. That person draws water from the yar b'deli v'shevel l'toich hasinar, and then he pours it into the pipe. She'avahu men l'sadris, and it comes from there into the field. So if you put your hands at the end of the pipe, which is at a distance away from where it was poured, and you think this is going to be considered a netila, that's where he said it does not work. So that's not called kayach gavra. It's not called that, even though, and of course the chiddush here is someone actually did the original pouring, but because after it was poured, it sat there and it traveled along the pipe, if it eventually gets to your hands, that will not work. Why? Because it's not called mikoychein bayim. Va'af, says the Mishnah Berurah Sivkatan Lamed Zayin, va'af Netilas Yadaim mikliu dafka, even though pouring your hands from the kli is precise, if you're close to the place of pouring, then if you're close to where it's coming out, then it's considered it's coming from the kli and not from the person who poured it there. Upasha, and this is obvious, that if you originally poured from a basal kli, you go in menuka of a kli with a hole, why didn't buy kli? So now here the Mishnah Brura throws in a very integral ingredient, which is going to unfortunately hurt us, but tells the halacha when it comes to a sink. Says the Mishnah Brura, there's two ingredients you always have to remember. Number one, which is what we're talking about right now, which is koyach gavra, has to be poured by a person. But then there's another integral ingredient that we keep on mentioning, which is what? That the water has to come from a kli, as we've said so many times. One of the very basic tenets of all of Netilas Yadaim for a Suda is that the water has to come from a kli, and if the water does not come from a kli, there's no Netilas Yadaim. So says the Mishnah Brura, what happens? I have this pipe, pouring the water into the pipe. It's running along the pipe. So I put my hands at the end. We said no good. Put your hands at the beginning. We said yes good. But says the Mishnah Brura, that's only if what? That's only if the cup, the item that I poured into the pipe originally with was a kli. But if it didn't originally come from a kli, if I took a bag, or I took a cup with a hole and I utilize that to pour into the kli, then it never starts because you never have the din of a kli. Aside for a case that we'll see in a moment. Which again, so why is this so relevant? This is so relevant. What to say the case is because all of our sinks. Because even though, and the Dirshu will speak this in a moment, even though if you open a faucet, the moment you open the faucet, you put your hands underneath, that first part that comes out, that's a machlokes, but we'll be lenient and we'll say that is called koyach gavra. That's called me pouring it, the fact that I opened this spout, similar to pulling out the plug. Gevaldik. But it's a different problem. There's no kli. Because where's the water coming from? The pipes, and all the pipes are connected to the ground and connected all the way back to the reservoir, etc. It didn't come from a kli. The fact that it didn't come from the kli is the reason why, basically unanimously across the board, washing from a sink, even with turning on the water in spurts, will not work because you're lacking in the ingredient of a kli. We continue, we said, that if you toivel your hands, you dip your hands in, you dip them into the water that's sitting inside the pipe, and you want to come to make a kosher how mikoyach tvila. Like maybe if you dial the tvila nami mahani liyadayim kshetovim l'mayim a mikvah, that it works. So you put it into a mayana spring or into a mikvah. Does not work in this case. Why? Because the water is she'uvim. She'im she'uvim sikavta l'tadas ve'im machshir mikoyach tvila, and drawn waters are not kosher to be used for tefillah. Ella, b'mayim machshir and the tefillah sagof. The only water that you can dip your hands in is the same water. You can be toivel your body in. V'ayin lekaman sifte zayin the Ravid machshav b'shuvin arba'im sa b'karka. The Ravid has a chiddush, and this potentially could help us maybe in a swimming pool. Says the Ravid that if it's she'uvin 40 sa in the karka, it will work. Ach the be'emes rabin pligale, many argue on the Ravid k'vod shekzani sham b'alacha. So there is a shitas Ravid that maybe could help us to dip your hands into the swimming pool. We have to mention if there's too much chlorine and therefore the water is not fit for a dog to drink, that will be a different problem. But regarding the tvila aspect, there is a shitas of a Ravid that is mekel. So now we said this is only, but what if you take the water chutz l'tziner, and you draw it into the tziner? Says the Mishnah Brura, how do you get rid of the fact that this water is drawn? So you're taking drawn water, you're taking sink water, and you want to pull it a little bit to get rid of the stigma that it's shuvim in order to validate it for tvila. It says in the Mishnah Brura, you have to draw 3 tfachim. The fact that it's in a pipe is not a problem. Because the pipe does not have a shame kli. It's not fully rounded like Kabul. Because if the sinner itself was a kli, the klal. And therefore, and if you do that, Shem Shichu, then you dip your hands into the waters of Katam Emalef. After the Netilas Yadaim Machmir, but that doesn't work. If all the white water is shuvim, it doesn't help that you draw 3 tefachim. For tefillah we will be mekel, and therefore it will be ksheros if katam in base. This is the reason why this doesn't really help us. It's only going to be if it's 40 sav. After man to make like one specific, you're daled with pachsmiz that there are shitas that are more mekel. Halayikradin, like the amshach gamkin kulohi. It's a kula. So how far are we going to take it? It says in Mishmur only if it's mem sav. It has to be together, not flowing. So the one case where there is a Minchas Yitzchak that entertains the following possibility, that if we just said it by opening the sink, it's not going to help because it's not called a kli. But says the Minchas Yitzchak that maybe if you plug up the sink and now the water is sitting in the sink and you move the water around, so now we could have this din of mayim she'uvim shem shichu. Then maybe you could dip your hands into it mikoyach tefillah according to this one shita. But again, as Mishmura says, this is not really so galat. Back to the Machaber. Va'afilu dailev and aisin, you draw and you give the teicha charitz atzma, you take and you pour it into a charitz. And matli naka me'achayrav, if the pail as a whole, b'koyin is mashka ba'oitche shevich derech piv letzina mekalech achrav le'ya'ar, matabos yadayim utahayris, chshivi kilu etzva ba'ya'ar, because then it is considered like you were table in the river itself. The nitzik zem mechaber akli le'ya'ar, v'chshiva mayim shebetzina mechubarim le'mei me'ya'ar. It's going to make it consider that the water in the pipe is connected. Afal gav, the nitzik is el chashav chibur linian tefillah, with regard to tefillah, this does not help, but for Netilas Yadaim, we're going to be a little bit more liberal. But again, these are difficult halachas. How we're creating this irrigational canal. Even for Netilas Yadaim, does not help. Says the Rambam, stones are in the wall. Vaslam beis kibelu barza. Avalim haya kli tchila v'chabel kaisel was a kli, and then they put it into the wall. Then noilim imanu, you could utilize it for Netilas Yadaim. Says the Mishnah Berurah, Teich Charitz if got them Gimel Ratzalaymar, Teich Charitz Shalatzimar within the ditch of the pipe. Akain is Mashkes of Kam and Dal. And again, these are intricate halachas. You have to really know a little bit more about tefillah and about this irrigation, etc. If to see the stream, we're trying to figure out that we have this irrigational canal. We want to get it connected to the main river so that it all could be considered at some level me mikvah, and I can put my hands into it. So if he's avishir kenekev ka'adasha, you need the hole to be the size of a lentil. Are you connecting the two? You're on a boat and you can't reach all the way down into the ocean. And you don't have a full vessel. You have a kli with a hole in it. So what do? You can draw into that pail and stick your hands in. Why? This really gives us a pretty good explanation of what's going on over here. Again, I have this cup and I can't reach my hands all the way into the ocean. So if I take the water out of the ocean, now the water is dripping out. So it says that the unique halach over here is that this drip connects this cup with the river ocean water, and then I can stick my hands into the cup and it's considered tevilah. Linyan tevilah have gotten mem vav. They need to in the chiber sham klal. V'gam ba'ivin the mahani sham eirav l'chaber amayim u'b'shir gadav like they need to dakozad. Only way it will help is if it's a real connection. Over here, as we're seeing, is not a real connection. It's just dripping. V'yish cholkis have gotten mem zayim rashal is kim kidei azum mikol makayim. Says the Mishnah Berurah b'shas adchak yish lismoich al dasa mikilim. In a time of need, there is a makayim to be mekel do das reva poiskim him tavel yadav al yidei hechsher chiber anitzak v'achach nizam lo tavel karoi. Allah that we saw the other day, that what happens if you utilize one of these sticks and then afterwards lemaisa you get to a place that you have regular water. What do you do now? Lo yivarech al tila shniya. You should wash your hands again, but you don't make a new bracha. Tal reva poiskim yatzi dei netila el yerabah v'kanem achulalam amukul al chemayim in ayar. And if you have these reeds that are open, hollow, that draw water from the river. If you put your hands underneath the stream, as we're going to see tomorrow, there is a sheet that holds you don't need koyach gavra. But the other qualification everyone holds of, possibly that kind of meaning keli, because these reeds, which is basically like a pipe, is not a keli she'ein bahem beis kibov gamin yachlat vol yadav berar kastin ha'omer svivam v'shenifzak hakiluach when I come aval beish ha'ilech hakiluach when I come him right lat vol yadav bekavsin while the stream is going for, and dip your hands into the stream yesh lemer deshar lekuli alma after yesh cholk and the nitik rachav because that's a wider spout. So again, this is more like sometimes it's like a runoff of the river. From the runoff, you can't actually put your hands underneath it because it's not called a koyach gavra and it's not called coming from a kli, but you can stick your hands into it and work as a tvila. This is more like a hose. You put your hand to the end of it. It is no. It's not a kli. Whatever this kli was, but you could put one hand there and use it to pour like a kli. Again, it's going to be a form of tvila. It's too high up. Finally, Sivkata and Mem Chazak Kavuv, then Netilas Yadaim Kli Be'inon. Again, I think it's the third mention just today. The necessity that you need a Kli, V'kimushin Kavuv B'kaisel. These stones are in Kikaisel V'insham Kli Aleim. Aval B'isha Aslan Beis Kibul, even though they're fashioned, they have something to hold the water. V'ayim Pripagadam Shad Lomi the Davka. Little Min Abarzel Derech Netilav, little B'toicham. If it has Arba'im Sa, Yishem Arba'im Sa, Yishem Achshem Mitam Tefillah Demut Arba'im Sa, as we've seen, if there's 40 Sa, then there's a Makatuvim Be'ekal, Ramam Sif Yudala that we will get to. V'la Avi Ketoivel B'kli, D'Mechubar M'chashiv Allah, B'kol Makam. Near a Pasha, De'in La'akal Bazel, Shamayim L'Nishavu Al Yedei Kli, you should not really be making on all these dinim. Kli Tchila, Tam Kivan She'in Aleim She'im Kli Tchila B'talosh, Chashvan Tilas B'kli, Noilim Yimanu Sivkata Non, Ratzleimer Derech, Barza Shem Siyah B'chol Shvicha Shvicha, D'Chashv Al Yedei Zeh, Koyach Gavra, which is Rabbi Sif test, which we will get to. So let's just take a moment. Let's take a moment and see these halachos about Koyach Gavra that we've seen so far. Here, let's begin with Dirshu note number 40. Says the Dirshu, Vatam Shenatila Psula, Shulchan Aruch saying because they're not coming from the Koyach Adam HaShevrich. Again, one person pours or runs down this pipe and you put your hands at the end, that's not called coming from Koyach Gavra. And even the Yesh Aymer that we're going to see tomorrow in Sivches, the Lamaisa, it works because you do not need Koyach Gavra. Sharatzian over there is going to explain that in this case it's going to be Moide, that it's going to be Basel. Why? Because even if you don't need the koyach hagavra over here, it's a nifsak koyach hashayfech, and therefore it's not considered connecting to the kli. So even though you might not need the koyach gavra, again, you always need the qualification of a kli. And if it's so removed that it's not even considered like it came from a kli, that itself will be a problem as well. And Sivkatan 42 points out, even if you're close to the place where they pour it, and yesh lamayim koyach halicha machas, it goes by itself, says the Chazon Ish, since it goes quicker because the person is pouring it, then it will be considered a koyach gavra. So now it says, okay, you just have to be careful, you have to be close to the place where the water is being poured. And really we're going to see more of this after we see Siftas, when we get a full picture of this necessity of Koyach Gavra, just to see this unique halacha. Dirshu number 47 comments, as we said, that if you're in the ocean, you can't reach the water, you could draw with the pail, and then it drips connecting it to the river, and you dip your hands into it. If you have a full kli, and you want to utilize the water of the river to wash from, says the Minchas Yitzchak, that sounds like it's no problem. But says the Shulchan Aruch later on, we're going to get to, that if the water is not royu for a dog to drink it, then it's going to be a problem. So what's going on? So Dirshu explains, since you're able to purify that water, but again, that will just really depend on what type of ocean, what type of river that you are in, whether the water lemaisa is going to be edible. And this is something that we're going to get to soon enough, b'siyata de shemaya. And finally, Dirshu number 48 points out, like we ended off, that even if it's going to be called, even if you don't need koyach gavra, but lamaisa there's no kli. If the kiluach is makif as kol yad, and says the Chazon Ish, you're able to stick your hand inside of it. Again, complicated when this will work and when this will not work. So Dirshu note number 52, even though it's very late in the year, I hope people get to this. Maybe we'll do this in a review as well. Points out the shayla that we keep on pointing out. What about derech barza shemishicha b'chol shvicha ushvicha? That if you're using the barza and you're going to keep on opening and closing it, does that work? Says Dirshu number 52, says the Zikan Aroin. Even if you open and close it, it still does not work. Why? Because there's no base kibul, therefore it's not called a kli. Rishon Zalman Arbach held the same thing. There's no way to wash your hands. The Arlet Sion adds on that even if you close it, and it maybe is considered a kli, but since it is connected, therefore it's not going to have a din of a kli. And therefore the Lamaisa, what goes on over here is that really all the Gedolei HaPoskim, Bipeh Malei, which is very difficult, are all saying that the shtick of opening and closing the berez will not work. And will not work. Now, let's say it does have its own base kibul. It quotes over here from Risalika Fisher. Then it's still going to have a different problem because it doesn't hold a revius. Meaning, even if the pipe itself or whatever it is, the water is held over there, but the Lamaisa doesn't hold the revius at one point, and therefore another reason it doesn't have a shem kli, and it's connected to the other pipes. Again, even though many, there's different fascinating ideas. What do you mean? The pipe is a kli, and the sink is a kli, and the faucet is a kli. We're seeing from all the Gedolei HaPoskim that Lamaisa, this does not work. And finally, we'll end with the words of the Minchas Yitzchak, which we pointed out. He's mistapek, maybe he does have a din of a kli, and he says the following. B'shas l'tchak, this is what you potentially could do. It's not so user-friendly, but let's just read his words. At least we could have some level of kula. You have netila and tvila. What does that mean? You open and close the barrels on each one of your hands, the faucet on your hand. Then that's considered netila. If maybe, perhaps, it has din of a kli, even though we saw really no one holds it as din of a kli. And then what do? The water inside the sink, away a little bit from the stream, you put your hands in, you toivel them in, and then maybe that's called that it's going to work b'kayach tvila. But again, he only says that you could do this b'shas adchak, and this doesn't, And Lamaisa, we've asked around, and Kemat Kol Gedolei HaPoskim come along and they say that it will not work. Why people believe it does work is very difficult. It says maybe if you have your water that's sitting on your roof, then maybe your Shlomo Zalman is going to say it's connected to the pipe and it will be called a koyach gav. It will work. But again, we didn't really have these mitzias. We have it in our hot water boiler, but you're not washing your hands with boiling water. And therefore, Lamaisa will end with the words that it's very shver, and to wash your hands by opening and closing the faucet, al pi pashtus, does not work for Netilas Yadaim for bread.